on one hand, I understand why it can be hard for somebody who is outside of like what we're talking about to try to grasp it, because it is so layered. There's so many things, and it's a lot easier to just put people into boxes and be like, this is what white people think, this is what Korean people think, just duck, 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 duck. And then they had to create a new box called mixed people. And the problem is there's no real box of just mixed people. Like, especially we are really clear when we separate Korean American or Korean and Thai, Korean and Malay, like, because everybody's coming from very different places. But it is hard because the world is so much bigger than what we like to label it as, because it helps us make sense of that. So that is, I think, the struggle when it comes to talking about mixed race issues, because it isn't just mixed race. It's like inside that, there's so many little categories and so many different people and backgrounds. So, I mean, that's part of the challenge. And it's also part of the fun because it has opened my eyes as well.
Welcome back to Mixed Up. I'm Nicole, and I'm recording solo today. I'm joined by Becky White, creator and co-host of the Halfie Project, a platform and community that explores mixed Korean subcultures and identity. One of the first platforms I found, actually, just to do with being mixed, I know, like you were saying, it's a niche topic that you cover specifically about being mixed Korean. But for someone like me, who isn't mixed Korean, but is just, it was looking for just this conversation in general, I was so happy to have found you, and it was amazing. And then, like, over time, I'd had more and more people send me your videos and like the other amazing interviews you've been doing with people, and that was just like so like validating for me. So I just want to thank you for all of the work that you guys have been doing over the years, because it's so invaluable and has been so meaningful to me.
It's amazing to hear that. I think, thank you so much for putting that into words, because I think we feel certain things and we want to have these conversations, or we want to say out loud those feelings that we have. And it's so hard to put it into words where you never actually hear it from somebody else. It's just like in your head. So it's very meaningful to hear you say that. So thank you. I'm glad our work is going somewhere,
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely is. And so I guess that's the best place for us to start, I think, which is essentially how you started the Halfie Project, how you and Cedric met and started collaborating together and working together. And just, starting a little bit from there.
Yeah. So the Halfie Project, I always tell people it's kind of part art, part research, born out of the question of identity. That was something that I just kind of whipped together so many years ago. If you start from the very beginning, so I am born to an American father, a Korean mother, and I was born in the US, but it was a military family, so we moved all over the place, and there was never a strong connection to a place, right? As in, so many people like to tout their citizenship as this is where I belong, but I never felt this kind of, rootedness. And so I ended up moving to Korea during college, more full-time, and then I stayed there for 10 years. And during that time, I was working at this very big company, and this is kind of where I came head-to-head with a lot of these unspoken feelings that I had, and also experiencing the biases and the prejudices that surround mixed Koreans, and in a very professional place, which was my first time because I never worked in an office like that. And I just remember grappling with that question and thinking, like, is there nobody around me who has ever felt this way? Is this normal? Like, to hear these comments about me, is it normal to feel so out of water? I always have, to an extent, but I think it was so concentrated at that time. And so I just remember putting that question out into the internet. I recorded this very lame video. My terminology is all over the place. I don't really know what I'm saying, but I think the heart was there. And it was very short, maybe 2 minutes. I just put it out there. Half Korean, American, what does this mean? And what does that feel like? Is there anyone else out there like that? And it was so unusual to see comments and then somebody reaching out and being like, I saw your video. And I think that was the first time I realized there are people who are actually looking for this. They're looking for these questions or somebody to talk to about that. And that's kind of where it first sparked. So really, I mean, it completely started from ground zero of me I made the graphic. I had this idea. I wrote down everything, and I was putting into words all of those feelings and thoughts I've been carrying for so long. And I started by myself. I was very fortunate to meet my teammates, the initial group, which would include Jay, who's Korean American, Michael, who was Norwegian Korean adoptee, and then Greg, who was a complete surprise. He's American. He met his Korean wife, and they had a child, and he had no idea what it was to be a father, to raise a biracial kid, to have a Korean wife. So he happened to find us, and we're really just such a motley crew. And then Cedric was the one who came into the scene last, and he has outlasted everybody, even though they're all part of the team still, of course, but he's the one that I work in the closest capacity. This is really turning into a long story. I realize.
No, this is a great. No, it's a great story. Because obviously this, you know, like you were saying before, it's like you were able to uncover something. Obviously something that's like so personal to so many of us, and like I find this in so much of, like you were saying, this is not only an investigative endeavor, but it's also art. And I find that as well for me, like the best pieces of art are when we kind of see ourselves reflected back. And that's what I found with you as well. So this makes so much sense.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's kind of been, I guess, our charming point, you could say, because we do talk about things from a point of whatever data we can collect. There's very little out there. Also, it's anecdotal, but we are trying to keep context and history and real world things in mind when we talk about this, not just this is how I feel and this is how I feel. I think you can relate strongly on an individual basis when there's an emotional pull, but when we're talking on society on a larger scale, we do have to bring those other issues to the forefront, and also just remember our context. You know, I'm not me living in the whole world. I'm part of the whole world. And so I think that has kind of been a bigger draw than just speaking about all the bad things that happen in our lives or trying to unload emotional feelings. That is part of it as well. But I do think that's how we can connect with more people.
For sure. And kind of, you know, like you were saying with Greg, your teammate, joining, and him kind of not even realizing like he is part of this world, part of this community. And it's something that he kind of just found himself in through falling in love and getting married, having kids. It is something that we found. I remember, you know, in the very early days of us starting the podcast, in the very early days of us, you know, writing this book and seeking other people out to talk to, we found that a lot of, funnily enough, a lot of monoracial people felt like it wasn't something that was for them, or they were kind of unsure if this was, if they could relate to it, which I found so interesting because I feel like because we are mixed people in general, like we relate to both or multiple things at once. And so the idea that it couldn't work in the other way was just so odd to me. And we've even had that when, you know, we're trying to send out copies of the book to, you know, press or other journalists or other people in the space, in the media. People are like, oh no, that's not for me. Because it's specific to race. It's like as though to say, oh, I don't need to be a part of that. Which I found really simultaneously interesting and frustrating.
Yeah, it is very, it's such an interesting point because it's like, oh, well, if this is not me exactly, then I'm not inside your box and I don't need to care about this. This is not, you know, this is not my issues. But the weird thing is, yeah, I mean, we're living in, there's very, very few places on earth where you're going to find purely 100% all one race or one ethnicity. You're going to interact with people from all different parts of the world. And why wouldn't you want to? I think that's the kind of baffling thing where it's like, there are so many people with so many different lived experiences, whether it's race or culture or language or whatever it is. Shouldn't you, if you're given the opportunity to learn more, that's just expanding your own world. And so that's just a happy byproduct of interacting with people from different cultures and backgrounds. And we just naturally do that growing up that way, you know? So yeah, I do think that is such a funny thing.
So strange. Yeah. I want to talk because Emma and I, my co-host, who's sadly not here right now, but we bonded very early on in our meeting. And when we first met, we talked a lot about obviously growing up in predominantly white environments. I grew up in the States in Virginia, and she grew up here in London. And kind of what that meant for us growing up and how we were kind of received by our peers, how we were received by friends and strangers and acquaintances, and how we as specifically mixed black women in this context get racialized very early on. But what I want to know is what was that like for you growing up? Did you experience that in your kind of early childhood or even, into your teens and adulthood?
It's so funny. I think like when you grow up in a certain way, you just think this is just life. You don't actually view it from an objective perspective. But looking back at it, now that I start to unpack it and now that I start to realize all of these traumatic feelings that I carry, they're rooted from something. I need to go back and figure out what that is. And that's kind of what I've been doing through Halfie Project. Because I always remembered growing up, we were so just shiftless. Like we're always going from one place to another. I don't recall actually having real friends until 16, maybe. And it's weird because before that, I can't remember a whole lot. I don't know if this is speaking into, bigger issues with my childhood.
I can imagine with moving a lot at that age. Yeah, that's a lot to take for a child.
But I can remember, like those nights where we would go over to my mom's friend's house and you're hanging out with all of their kids and everyone's Korean. And then there's just you. And there's always going to be that question. They'll sometimes look at you or sometimes they'll say, do you speak Korean? No? Okay, we're speaking English, guys. Like you'll have this kind of moments. And then I remember in high school when I first met like other Koreans who were my age and we were interacting with each other on a daily capacity and how we became friends. And I just remember the questions and I remember the feelings of alienation sometimes or the feelings of intense belonging, like really wanting that. And it was just, I don't know, you don't know how to process all of those feelings in the moment unless you're, extremely emotionally intelligent. And then it's later on where I start to look back and think, oh, wow, that was my interactions with Koreans and, things that my white teachers might say about me in class publicly or in, groups of people, especially at school. It happens a lot. I also went to primarily white schools and, just remembering the things this person said or the things they said. And at the time, you just felt confused. You don't know what to say. You don't know how to stand up for yourself. And then I slowly track back and think on it. Be like, man, this is what I would have said today. Or this is how I process that. So it has been a very weird experience, I think, kind of unpacking all of that. And I think I'm still working through that, to be honest. I don't know about you.
Same. Absolutely same. And I think, you touched on something really important is that, obviously when we're children, we don't really have the language to describe to ourselves or to other people kind of what's going on internally and even sometimes externally when it comes to just regular growing pains, but obviously something that's so specific to our experience of being mixed. And language is such a huge thing because, even when it's like when you don't have the words for something, you kind of feel like you don't get to say anything. And that's something for me that I feel like really personally attached to because, speaking languages, speaking multiple languages, the ability to speak the language of your parents, which is something that I don't have. So like my dad is from Ghana, so he speaks multiple languages within Ghana, like Twi, Fanti, Ga, and my mom's from the Philippines, so she speaks Tagalog. And the fact that I can't do that still to this day, I can't speak their languages, is something that I still really struggle with. I was in a Filipino cafe the other day and it was such a nice feeling because I was like, oh, I feel like I'm at home and I'm like listening to like my aunts and uncles speaking Tagalog, and then I realized like I still don't understand what anyone's saying. So it was like again a simultaneous feeling of like, oh, this is so nice and comforting, but like simultaneously like, oh, like a sense of like guilt and shame. But this isn't about me.
No, but to touch on
Even
that really fast, like in terms of language, it's funny you tie that feeling of comfort and belonging because you grew up hearing it and from the people that you loved or felt safest with. But then there's a certain point where it's like, but you're still barred entry because you didn't learn the language and you do feel guilty and shamed. But here's the weird thing. That was not anything in your control, right? Like nobody taught you or you weren't in, an environment where you could absorb that naturally. And it's weird how we carry that feeling of guilt
oh
and
my
shame.
gosh, absolutely, absolutely. It's a lot to carry, and you're so right, especially when you're a child, when you're growing up and you're kind of in those early stages of being able to learn, and no one teaches you, or like you said, if you're not like literally absorbed within the language, which is what makes it easy to learn. Yeah, then it gets much harder as you get older. But what's your relationship like with language, with the Korean language?
Yeah. So my mom speaks English fairly well. And it's because my dad put zero effort in learning Korean. And my mom looking back at it now, she learned from zero, from total scratch. They didn't speak the same language when they met. And so I really respect how much she learned and how rapidly. And it's weird that she still carries this feeling of guilt herself on the opposite end. Like, because she was always around people in my dad's work, and it's just a different level. And so she always felt like, oh, I'm not good at English. I'm uneducated. I'm blah, 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 all these things. And, I grew up hearing those things from her all the time. But now as I interact with other Korean Americans or Korean immigrants, so many of them don't speak English to the same level that my mom does, but she still carries it. It's just it's so weird to see. Yeah, and I think like that kind of gave me an extra burden because I would hear her say that on herself all the time. And then I wouldn't be speaking Korean fluently. And it was kind of my fault that I couldn't help her navigate this part, or it was my fault that I couldn't clearly explain to her. And I remember us having conversations where I would be like, this is before I spoke Korean. I would tell her, oh, Mom, why didn't you tell me about those things? How come you didn't mention this issue with the family? Why didn't you tell me what you felt in this moment? And she would just say like, you don't speak Korean, you don't understand. And it's such like a hard shutout. And it's based around language, nothing that I could have or change about myself in the moment. So yeah, it's such like a weird, complicated, emotional thing. It's not just like, oh, this is a new skill I've acquired. It's tied to so many memories and feelings and moments, and you feel like you miss a lot of it. So anyway, when I was 16, that's when I first, like I mentioned, met my first Korean friends. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to learn. And I would sit down and I studied so hard, Nicole. Like I just, now I don't know how I did it, but since from then and then up to the point where I felt like I know what I'm doing, I would memorize hundreds of words every day. I would write and write and write and write and read. And I was obsessed. And I think it was just this, I don't know if I was possessed by the spirit of my mom, and all the shame that she's felt all her life. And I was like, I'm going to do this. And I really put that effort in. It's paid off massively, but it's weird. The feeling of guilt never goes away. Like, I don't know if I'm still working on that, but yeah, I still feel it sometimes when I get something wrong or I'm in public and I use the wrong word and they look at me and I'm like, man, like,
It's
I
the
still didn't
getting
get it.
something wrong. It's so true. And I remember, so me and my parents went to the Philippines about 2 years ago, and it was the first time I was back there since I was about 4 years old, I think. And again, I was like okay, I'm gonna like, there's some phrases and words in Tagalog that I know, and I was like, I'm gonna pick some stuff up, and like, not that I was gonna leave fluent or anything like that, but I was like, I feel like I'm gonna maybe grow in confidence. And my dad also doesn't speak Tagalog at all, but I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, surely he knows more than me. I was like, because he's been around it longer than me. but he doesn't have a clue. And he would just go out and just say completely the wrong words, like completely the wrong greetings, completely the wrong, like just everything wrong, but like was so fine with it. Like he didn't mind. He kind of just like was barreling through, just like putting himself out there and like wanting to communicate. Whereas with me, I was so reserved. So like I go to my mom, what, how do you say this again? Slower? How do you pronounce? And I was just so like terrified of getting it wrong, terrified of feeling embarrassed, and also like not wanting to offend anyone, like all of those things. And it was just such a funny difference between the two of us and like our attitudes towards the language. And I think a lot of my things is obviously it's so personal to being mixed, I feel like. And yeah, completely about how people are going to perceive you. But he was just like cool with it. He just didn't care.
So funny. That is actually really funny. But it's like you can see, you know what I think it is? I do think that language, especially when you're mixed, you're looking for every single flag and marker to collect or check off so you can wave in front of people and say, look at me, I'm one of you. And language is one of those things. And so it's not something we hold lightly, right?
Exactly. It's not a frivolous thing for us at all. And you're so right in that so much of, especially again, when for me, when I was really young, was very much a, yes, here I'm going, like, trying to collect all of the different tokens and pieces that will prove to people that I'm part of this group. And yeah, I like to think that I've gotten better about that now, but I definitely still have those moments of like a little knock here and there will make me be like, oh no. Just brings you back to that point. It brings you back to that childhood point. This is a therapy session, basically.
No. I didn't know what was going to come out of this. I told Cedric this morning, he was like, what are you guys going to talk about? And I was like, you know what? We'll see what comes out.
Who knows? Yeah, exactly. But obviously, I mean, we're still, you know, kind of like on this language track. And also in writing our book, we had a chapter that was, funnily enough, really sparked by Rachel Dolezal and how she kind of co-opted the term transracial. And you know, Emma and I, we had watched the documentary in lockdown. It was like the first time we'd ever seen it. And we were just like, oh my gosh, this was really, it felt really personal to us because we were like, this is someone who's talking about race in a way that feels like we should be able to relate to what she's saying. But she's also someone that has kind of taken a conversation that felt very much like a mixed conversation and almost made light of it due to who she was. That's all kind of just context, but in writing the chapter about transracial adoption was kind of where we came across some really important historical moments in Korean history that I definitely didn't know. I didn't learn, you know, in school, and hadn't considered. And so much of what we again talk about on the podcast is our history as mixed people in general, and how a lot of the different ways people talk about being mixed online, especially, is that it's like this trendy thing, and like people think you're like cool and people want to have mixed babies or something. But it's so like, it just goes back so much farther than that. And so, yeah, that main thing of just kind of trying to get across to people that we've always been here. But what I found so interesting was coming across, is it pronounced Hunyol?
Hunyol.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And just, again, the different words for being mixed, you know, not just in Korea, but across the globe, and all of those things. How have you found that as well in your work with Halfie? Those kind of histories coming out, what have you uncovered? What was something that really stood out to you?
To be honest, there's, you know, I do think this, first and foremost, as my research project, it started out as a very personal, emotional project. And now as it's continuing, I realize, whoa, this is research. And we're uncovering these stories that people for so long were ashamed to talk about or felt like nobody cares to hear, but it's so valuable. And I think it corresponds with what we're seeing with Korean adoptees now, because so many Korean adoptees in the first and second wave have reached an age where they are willing to speak out about it. And so it's becoming more prominent and people are learning more about it. And I'm kind of learning simultaneously about those things as well. And it's not just about Korean adoptees who have gone primarily to the US, but also to other parts of the world. And learning about Koryo Saram, we have the people who were in the post-Soviet Union states, the Koreans who migrated to there. And then we also have Zainichi that's come out with Pachinko. And so many like groups of the Korean diaspora that maybe at some point in my life, I might have heard here or might have heard there, but now that I actively seek it out, then these stories are starting to come forward. And I think it's almost surreal to see that happen, and also to get these messages from people being like, no one ever asked me that before. And just recognizing, the importance of it. It's been, I think for myself as well, what's been really difficult is doing this all in English, because I first started grappling with these mixed Korean issues and Korean cultural issues in Korea. And so I had the vocabulary in Korean. And then here in the US, we're speaking to a wider audience, trying to use words like, for example, 혼혈 sounds so innocent to someone who doesn't speak Korean. But 혼혈 itself, it literally just means mixed, 혼 from the Chinese character, and 혈, blood. That's all it is, mixed blood. But it carries connotations of dirty blood, confused blood, right? Tainted blood. And it's so weird. So if I use that word with some Korean speakers, they might feel uncomfortable. And so we're finding this, and you're probably experiencing this as well, like this, you're running into the literal definition of a word used to describe something and the connotations and historical context and emotions that it carries. So it makes this conversation sometimes really difficult to have. To be honest, with the name Halfie Project, like the only people who really disliked it were Americans. And it was so weird to see that, because in Korean, if you transliterate, it's happy, which sounds like happy. So it's just such an odd, combination of all of those things.
That is so interesting. That's so interesting because very recently we did an episode that was specific to the colored classification in South Africa. And because we came across this book and it was just so fantastic. Again, so much history, so much apartheid history of the country, again, like migration and all of this stuff that that makes up obviously the country of South Africa. And we did this interview, and it was inspired by the singer Tyla appearing in the US and talking about being colored. And obviously the connotations of being colored in the US are completely different to the connotations of being colored in South Africa. And, she was met with a lot of backlash, a lot of, comments from people online who were just like, how can, and it's kind of so like US centered. It's so just like, oh, how can, you market to us in the US and like say this and all this kind of thing. Still very, very misunderstood about what she's saying and about who she is. And again, as a colored woman, but also as a Black woman. And so there's so much discourse about how she can't be both. She's just this one thing. She can't say the word colored. And the episode is obviously these academics, these scholars who are talking about the history and the future of colored people in South Africa following apartheid. And now we've got, again, this pop star example of what that looks like and what the reality is. And people still very much not getting it, as in like, they're not getting the language. They don't know what it means to be colored in the sense of being colored outside of the United States. And yeah, so that just sparked that memory in me, in terms of different language and different connotations in different countries, because it is such a global thing, and our reactions to those things are so different.
It is really true. And I think this was kind of why when we moved to New York from Seoul, I was very hesitant to continue the project here, because I just felt like there's a very American-centric mindsets that exist on the internet, especially when we talk about race, and especially when we talk about like mixed Koreans. The prevalent concept people have about mixed Koreans is they're almost always going to be Korean and white, and probably Korean and American. Like, this is, when you read a book and they don't describe what a person looks like, you imagine a white person saying it, just because that's just how it's been. And so I think we've also been kind of tearing those ideas apart on what it means to be mixed Korean. Yeah, it can exist in many different forms in many different places. So that was something I was hesitant, because I just feel like I'm one voice. I can't like address everybody at once. And I did have to grow a thicker skin for sure, because we would get a lot of interesting commentary. And, what has also been interesting is that when Cedric joined the team, somehow it shifted our dynamic a little bit. I think in the public eye, I don't know if I'm speaking for people or not, but it's one thing to be white and Korean and talking about these things, and to be Black and Korean and talking about these things. And I think us coming together, I don't know if it makes people feel like we're covering the spectrum, quote unquote, but in a way, it just kind of bolstered what we were saying and be able to communicate with more people. And I've really appreciated that. But yeah, it has been really weird too, because you're going to get all kinds of viewpoints, and you have to be willing to understand where they're coming from as well.
Absolutely. And that's so interesting that you say that again about you and Cedric kind of coming together. It's something that Emma and I come across a lot as well, especially being obviously, being from the US myself, and also here in the UK, just in general, the concept of mixed race or being mixed, in the idea in people's minds is that you're mixed Black and white. That's the only thing that they think of. That's kind of the stereotype. Anytime someone talks about, being light skinned or anything like that, that's the implication is that they're talking about a mixed Black and white person. And so for me, that's not my experience. And so I found that really tough to deal with online, when people would just assume that that's my mix. And also just, in general, out in public, people in general just assuming things about me. But we found that as well in terms of, again, the discourse here in the UK. There isn't a lot of room for anyone outside of there's only room for one voice. And so again, when we're talking about mixed identity, when we're talking about mixed heritage, anything, and being multicultural, if they've written one article about it, or they got one mixed person to say something to comment, they're just like, okay, we've covered that. We've covered the spectrum of experience, and we won't touch this issue for another 6 months. And obviously you and I both know how vast our experiences are, how different they all are, and how global they are. And yeah, so much of our frustration has been, really trying to get people to understand not only how different it is, but also how much it implies to everyone because of that reason. It touches everyone.
On one hand, I understand why it can be hard for somebody who is outside of what we're talking about to try to grasp it, because it is so layered. There's so many things, and it's a lot easier to just put people into boxes and be like, this is what white people think, this is what Korean people think, just duck. And then they had to create a new box called mixed people. And the problem is there's no real box of just mixed people. Especially we are really clear when we separate Korean American or Korean and Thai, Korean and Malay, because everybody's coming from very different places. But it is hard because the world is so much bigger than what we like to label it as, because it helps us make sense of that. So that is, I think, the struggle when it comes to talking about mixed race issues, because it isn't just mixed race. It's inside that there's so many little categories and so many different people and backgrounds. So, I mean, that's part of the challenge. And it's also part of the fun, because it has opened my eyes as well. Just as I learned and also continue to discover new people all over the place.
Absolutely. No, I'm the exact same. It's so heartening to see that. I think that's one of the best things about what we do is just being able to see, to access, listen to all of these different people's stories. And it's just, yeah, it's such a beautiful thing.
Our book, The Half of It, is out this summer. The book is not only an extension of ourselves, but everything we talk to you about on this podcast and in the DMs. Please head to the show notes where you can find a link to pre-order. Pre-orders are so important for new authors, so support us and get your copy now.
Could I ask you something?
Yeah, of course.
So
Two interviewers interviewing each other.
Yeah, I know, right? I'm sorry to cut you off. I really
No,
just wanted
please.
to know. So this is something that happens to me very frequently, but it did just happen to me yesterday. And I wanted to see, how would other people respond to this? But I was on set because I do model work as well. And there was a model, and she's a white girl, and we sat next to each other, and we were just chit-chatting. And she just looked at me, and she was like, "Oh, are you Asian?" And I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "Oh, what Asian are you?" I said, "Oh, I'm Korean." And then she looked closer at me, and she goes, "So are you like full Korean?" I said, "Oh, actually, I'm half." And she goes, "Oh, your mom's Korean, right?" It's like, "Yes." And then she said, "Oh, your mom knew what she was doing when she locked down a white man, because she knew she could get a kid who looks like you." And I was very taken aback in that moment. Not that it's a unusual comment to get, but the fact that she was very forthright. We had just met, and she just put it out there, and then she laughed, and she goes, "Oh, ha, 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 now you don't have to do the double eyelid surgery that all those Koreans do."
Oh my gosh, she even went further than that.
So I was kind of like, wow. I mean,
wow.
I'm a little impressed that you know this much about double eyelid surgery and everything. Yeah, but very bold. And so anyway, in that moment, I felt a little ashamed because I laughed. I was like, "Oh, ha, 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 yeah, I don't need it." And then move on. But how do you respond in these instances? And I've kind of thought, like, is it one of those cases where you just can't respond because it's so fast, you never see them again? Is that the right timing? Because when you talk about these kind of issues or sensitive conversations, timing is so significant and so important. Would I do worse by bringing it up in that moment? Or, so in that moment, like, for you personally, how would you handle that? I'm just curious.
That is such a tough one. I am definitely inclined to be the person that laughs off something that makes me feel very uncomfortable. And while I haven't had that very specific comment, I've definitely had, because what I'm hearing her saying is, it's like, you're beautiful because you're mixed white. Like, that's what I'm like receiving from her saying that, which makes me feel really disturbed and upset. But I think I've been on the receiving end of things like that. Oh, the explanation as to why someone would, find me beautiful or attractive or, think I'm pretty for whatever reason, is because of my being mixed, Filipino, being mixed Asian. And people are like, "Oh, that's why. Oh, that makes sense. That's why you look like that. That's why." And yeah, and it's like it's simultaneously the feeling of someone trying to figure you out, like there's something wrong with you, and then simultaneously, again, this explanation of, "Oh God, like thank goodness you're not fully black," is what I'm hearing, like when I get those kinds of comments. But yeah, when those have happened to me, and those kinds of comments have happened, like I've heard them since I was maybe like quite young, and I've always just been like, "Oh." I think like I kind of visibly shrink, but like I kind of laugh it off because of the discomfort. And again, because I agree with you in that I feel like timing is everything in teachable moments. And I think a lot of the times when people say those things, it's like they're trying to connect with you on some level as well, which I think sounds nuts, but it's like it's like that, you know, that way when you're like trying to make small talk almost, but like they're trying to just like get a little bit deeper in there. They think they're complimenting you and they're actually insulting you. But yeah, I feel the same way in that I don't know that I would have, and it's not that I can't defend myself or that I don't have the language to do so, but I think I'm also really aware of those moments when people aren't going to take in what I'm saying. And even just like from a safety level as well, like just my own personal like safety and sanity, I'm just kind of like, I don't know that I want to get into this with you.
You can't take all of them every time.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I can't believe that happened. I can't believe that she went so detailed.
She was very bold. She was super bold. I almost
so
have to admire
bold.
that. Wow.
Yeah, I almost admire it.
Right.
But this is kind of a good segue as well, because I'm curious about, you know, if there have been any really notable differences that you've seen, you know, as a mixed Korean in the United States or just in the West in general versus in Korea or in other Asian countries. Like, that's something that, you know, I feel like, me personally, I never feel like I'm going to go to the Philippines or go to Asia, to any other Asian countries and think, oh, people are going to see me as Asian. But yeah, I don't know if that's been the case for you.
Yeah, it's been unusual. So every place that I go to, or every country or groups of people that I visit, there's always, I know I'm always coming into a new context, and I'm always coming into a new collective idea of what it means to look like this. So, for example, when I went to the Philippines, I have a friend, she married a Filipino guy. They live on Cebu. When I go to the Philippines, it's so lovely there. But
it's so nice there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I came back and I was like, everyone needs to go there. I'm like, I know it's far, but you must go.
Oh, it's amazing. I love Cebu.
Yeah. It's so beautiful.
I did think for half a second after she got married, I was like, maybe I should just move there. Like, she looks like she's having a great life. I mean, I know there's all kinds of things. There's no perfect place, but man, it looks nice. Yeah, but like for example, I went to Cebu and I was getting coffee, and, you know, coffee worker will look at me like this, and they're like, are you Korean? Are you Korean? And then if I say yes, the reaction is sometimes like, wow, that's so great. We love Korean dramas. So I understand what context I'm walking into. Versus, say, in the US, the context can be very, very different, right? Oh, maybe a war bride, or, oh, prostitution, or you're an adoptee. So there's a different context that exists around that. And same with in South Korea. People might ask me like, oh, they say like, 우리나라 사람이야, are you one of our country people? Which is a loaded question, right? And so you could, depending on how I choose to respond, it also changes the way people react to me. So it's a very curious thing, because it's just how I look. I can't help it, but you have to start becoming tuned and aware to how people are going to respond to you and how you decide to answer in that moment. Do I want to have this conversation right now or not? Is this going to matter? Yes or no? So sometimes if I can just get by, like especially in the US, oh yeah, I'm Korean, and just let it get by. And in Korea, it's a lot harder. But in Korea, you know, sometimes people will just assume, oh, she's just Korean, and then just let it slide by. Or if I choose to pull out the foreigner card, then you have to go through the whole conversation. So yeah, it is weird to feel that. I was with a group of Mongolian friends, and we were going out one night. And I remember the bouncer at the door was like, oh, we don't like Koreans in here. And so I was like, oh, I showed him my Korean residency. And then he was like, oh, well, I thought you were just, are they with you? And I was like, yes, these are my friends. And there was like a clear separation, but he didn't see it on me at first because I was with all my Mongolian friends. So it's kind of weird the way that happens. I don't really know where I'm going with that statement, but you notice like the way you actually interact with the world and the way you present yourself is very strongly dependent on who you're talking to and where you are. I don't know what that would be called. I don't know if that's code switching. I don't know what that's called, but
yeah, again, code switching was something that Emma and I, talked about again very early on, again, as people who, visibly look Black and kind of grew up in predominantly white spaces. And, say, like for me, just the way that I am and speak and naturally and talk, I think some people could perceive that to be a kind of code switching thing. But for me, it's just a very natural thing in that, and I can imagine would just be a natural thing for most people. Again, like you're saying, it just depends on your environment, depends on who you're speaking to, who feels comfortable to be around, what's acceptable to say, what's not acceptable to say in kind of homogenized groups. And yeah, I think it almost feels like a very natural thing. But it's also, it can be something that can feel uncomfortable at times too. Like with everything, there's so much context and so much, so much attached to it.
Yeah, I think when you carry on your face, you actually carry in your skin certain perceptions or stereotypes or expectations, and you are constantly pushing against those whenever you go into a new space. I think that's why it gets tiring, because you're right. Everybody changes depending on who they're with. Everybody does. We all, shift a little bit here and there. Do I get on with you? Are we the same like this? But in our case, I feel like it's so prevalent, and also
exactly. We're so visible. Yeah. We're so visible. Yeah. And it's so loaded. You're so right. I really loved the episode also that you and Cedric did about multicultural relationships and how kind of you ultimately have found yourselves in an interracial relationship as well, which I didn't even really consider. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so nice. Even though, you're both mixed Korean. Is there anything, what have you kind of taken away from that? Like, is there anything that stood out to you, being in an interracial relationship in this way? And also because your work is so tied to talking about race and identity, how does that affect you both?
Yeah, I would say, I think of all the relationships with people I've met in my life, he has been the most formative for me, not just as an individual, but as myself in the world. I think in the terms of us both being mixed Korean, and also the way his relationship with his mother is, the way he lived in Korea like I did, the way we have so many similar thoughts about being mixed Korean, that connected us. And also, like, I don't know, in a way, it just made me feel more secure in those thoughts I already had, but who would understand, who would hear that? And he was just dialed in. And I think that has definitely helped me feel more secure in myself as mixed Korean, for sure. Now, when we bring into the other aspect, I'm part white, he's part Black, and that plays a role when we're in Korea, especially. People view us differently. They treat us differently. And I think prior to being with Cedric, because in a way, I have to look through his eyes. When you're in a relationship like this, we're so close, I have to also feel his experiences as much as I can. And prior to him, I never did. I always lived the white Korean experience. And I think for myself, it's really opened up my eyes to these subtle biases or prejudices that people carry. You might know in your head, but now when you're actually feeling it happening to a loved one so close to you, it definitely changes a little bit how you feel about people. I have experienced anger on my own behalf, of course, but that's more like, oh, don't hurt me, you guys are mean. But when it's happening to someone else, it's almost like a righteous anger. Like you can't say those things about people I love. So it's been really interesting navigating those feelings, and also taking all the things that he has learned from his parents, because he has had to learn different things than what I've learned from my parents about how the world will view us. And it's just been so, I don't even want to say like enriching, like he's educating me. It's not even that. It's just we're going through life together, and my perspective of the world is opening.
Expansive. Yeah. It feels very, very, it sounds like it's very, very expansive, which is only an amazing thing.
Yeah. I really admire his parents. I think the way that they have raised him something like I grew up myself with a kind of complicated home life, and I think that has poured into the way I view myself and the way I have tried to secure my identity. While on the other hand, Cedric grew up with a mom who thinks he's the greatest thing ever. First son who's a Korean mother.
Yeah.
And a dad who just seemed extremely secure in his own skin and who had gone through many difficulties in the US but passed on to his son just this sense of being secure in yourself, regardless what the world around you sees or thinks about you. And compounded with those two things, Cedric is just like this great guy. And sometimes I really admire that. Like, wow, you're so... I mean, we experience difficulties being biracial, but in a way, he's so secure in his skin. And I really admire that. Yeah.
Yeah, you definitely get a sense of that in your very early interviews, where I think he says something along the lines of like, I think it's something, and it's something I took note of it because it's something that my dad always used to say as well, where he's like, I'm just me, as in like, because I often, again, even still to this day, sometimes can get really wrapped up in, you know, how people are perceiving me and what this means, and like really just like getting into the minutia of things. And my dad is always such a like kind of take a step back and very like, you're just you, like I'm just me, and you know, this is what it is. And I picked up on that with Cedric in your early conversations, and I was just like, oh yeah, he feels very like at ease in himself.
Yeah. I don't know. Okay, I don't know if you've noticed this, but this is something we talk about pretty often. When we see, so we know a handful of Korean adoptees who have been adopted into white families, and a handful have been adopted into Black families. And there is a difference in conversation around race. And I think that, especially in the US, Black people have had to encounter this question of race and who they are, and have that discussion a lot more frequently than white families may have had to. And I feel like there's a better security in being able to talk about race when you are with Black friends. Like, this is something that I felt very clearly when I overhear Cedric talking with his aunt, for example, versus when I'm with the white side of my family. There's this kind of like, we don't want to talk about that.
We don't want to say this.
We don't want to offend this. But there's a lot more openness and freedom to be able to speak openly about race and racial issues.
Yeah, I think you've definitely touched on something I hadn't considered, but yeah, that's so true. I think that's definitely something that I always knew I could go to my dad specifically, being the Black parent. I knew I could go to him to say what I needed to say. And that's not to say I didn't speak to my mom about things, but it was like that relationship was always going to be, it already has that tie, and that like, this is how the world sees me. And so I know I can come to you about this issue, and you're going to just get it right away. So I can definitely understand that. We talked a bit about home as well very early on when we started. And obviously you were talking about, you know, moving around a lot when you were growing up. And interestingly enough, home is something that we talk a lot about on the podcast, because a lot of mixed people that we've spoken to in like the DMs or even in comments have said, you know, they may have not, you know, traveled to or spent a significant amount of time in their ancestral home, for example, or their place of birth, or the places of their parents' birth. Where do you feel at home now, and where do you feel kind of the most rooted, and what makes it that way for you? Is it a specific place? Is it the people? Is it food? Is it just a feeling? What is that like for you?
Yeah. Home. Yeah, we do talk about that a lot. I wrote an article last time when I was in Korea earlier this year. I remember writing it as I was waiting for after a flight, and I just like was writing down those feelings. That was the question that I had, like, home, where is home? And I don't know, I'm still grappling with that. I think growing up, just naturally when you're a child, you expect your home to be within your family, people who are immediate to you and who should love you the most. And so I always just equated like, oh, wherever my parents are, I guess that's home, whichever state, you know, that was. And then as I've gotten older, I realized no, that's not it. And I don't feel a very strong sense of patriotism, let's say.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I also don't equate Korea as my home because there's constant pushback to saying like, oh, where are you from? Where are you from? Where are you from? So I don't know yet. I do think as time has gone on, and this scares me a little bit, but I just think like, oh, wherever Cedric is, that's my home. And is this, extreme attachment? I don't know. But I sometimes feel
No, that sounds nice. Yeah.
just that's something that I've said to him, just kind of like, oh, well, I don't care where we live as long as I'm with you. I don't really care where it is. And I used to think it was a negative, as in like, oh, I don't belong anywhere. But now I feel like, oh, this means I could belong anywhere.
You could belong everywhere. Yeah.
To an extent. And it's up to me on how I build that community. But yeah, we've wondered about that. Like, what would it be like to go to a country where everyone looks like you? You know what I mean? What would that feel like? I don't know. I can't even imagine it. But for the time being, I would probably say that's my idea of home. Home is where they want you, and home is where they love you. And for me, that's with Cedric.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I feel the same way in that, like, I obviously I grew up in Virginia. I moved to London when I was about 20. How was I? Like 21. And so, yeah, like most of my adult life now has been here in London. And I still grapple with that. I'm still like, where do I belong? Like, should I go back? When do I go back? Will I go back? Should I move somewhere else? Like, yeah, all of those questions are constantly just being mulled over in my mind. So
Do you have plans to stay there long term more?
I'm gonna get my citizenship, for sure. I've acquired enough years in the country, so I was like, I might as well get it done. Stop paying for visas. Gonna get that, and then we'll see after that. I think obviously the older I get, the more I'm like, should I be close to my parents? Like, they're getting older, I'm getting older. So that's the thing that keeps me kind of going back and forth and being like, oh, maybe I should move home. But then I'm like, I don't know what I would do in Virginia. I'm like, what do I do there now? Obviously doing this work is so great. And it does, to an extent, mean you can do it from anywhere. But obviously being in bigger cities affords you more access and opportunity. So that's also something that I've struggled with, being like, oh, am I going to go back to suburban Northern Virginia?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Hard question to answer.
It's a hard question to answer. But yeah. And so I know we're getting down to the final bits of questions I have for you. And this is really, mostly about the conversation about mixedness in general, and kind of like what you've seen again in the work that you do. And something that really stood out to me especially in the earlier interviews was when you were talking about, this extreme dichotomy in attitudes that mixed Koreans face in Korea. It was like simultaneously like being exoticized or fetishized, especially if you're mixed white, and people wanting mixed babies, but also at the same time being kind of used as this example of what is wrong with, mixing or intermixing of races. And have you found that this attitude has changed, or does it look any different? Has the language around it changed?
Yeah. If so, narrowing it down to Korea, I would say it has changed. It's definitely improved dramatically since what it used to be. But you still encounter people who say, "Well, I've never seen a foreigner in my life." And
Okay.
it's interesting to have like this range of responses, and a lot of it is just dictated about your own experiences, how many places that you've traveled in Korea. Like, the average person doesn't know what it feels like to be a minority. This idea of minority and discrimination doesn't really exist, and so it's kind of hard to express that to somebody who doesn't know what that feels like. And at the same time, you have so much history and context. And with these faces, mixed Koreans physically are the remnants and reminders of very terrible times in Korea in the past. And it's a lot easier to just push those people away so you don't have to think about it than actually grapple with things that really happen to your country as a whole. And so, yeah, it is a very interesting experience because you're also dancing on now these changing times of being half Korean is so cool, and they like K-pop idols who are half Korean, and the models, you guys have the most beautiful faces, quote unquote, and everyone wants to have mixed children. There's a new generation that's growing up, and so it is weird because we have 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 generations now of mixed Koreans kind of coexisting, and everybody has very, very separate experiences, completely, not hated, but thrown away and abandoned. And then you have slowly transitioned to, oh my God, you have the cutest child ever. I wish I had a half Korean kid. And it's existing at the same time in this small society. So it's been very, very unusual seeing how that's changed. And I know the pendulum always swings. It always goes harsh one way or the other. So maybe we were harshly on abandonment and harshly now, super fetishization. And somewhere has to fall in the middle of this is just what it looks like to be Korean now. Korean, the idea of what is Korean is just expanding. And I think right now we're seeing society grapple with that and trying to figure out, okay, where are we going to land? What does that mean? How far is that boundaries of quote unquote Korean, that definition space? And that's just happening right now. So it's interesting being part of those conversations and seeing literally people's minds changing in real time. And so this is why we're really cautious when we share stories or, talk about this or write, come from either a very personal perspective that nobody can dispute or come in with just the information and not an opinion that I'm pushing because I'm leaving it up to people to kind of decide for themselves. But being mixed Korean in Korea is a very unique experience. I don't think there's many countries in the world that have this kind of history in this context tied to mixed race like this. It's been interesting, but we'll see what's going to come from it, and we'll just keep doing what we do.
I've now just been inspired by it to ask you a totally different question. Which is more to do with beauty, and obviously because you do modeling work as well, and you've modeled in both the U.S. and Korea. What's that been like for you in terms of beauty standards and again like in casting and like what's that experience been like for you?
Yeah, I always tell people the modeling industry itself should not be our benchmark of what is considered beautiful. Unfortunately, it is. That's what it has become. And so, in this way, I've come to terms with it where I just think, okay, if this is just what the current times consider as beautiful, I'll take advantage of that. And I gratefully accept any work that comes my way because modeling is a very short-lived career. However, I also know that it does play a role in shaping how people view people who look like you. If you never saw anybody on the billboards, let's say, who's plus sized, you might be thinking your whole life plus size is not beautiful. And it can be the same thing with mixed faces in Korea. And so I also do recognize that there is a power to being able to show a face that now society says, oh, this is the faces we like and this is beautiful people. And it's just so weird. Like, in Korea versus the US. In Korea, it's almost a little bit more cut and dry. It's a little bit more narrow. People know what they're going to expect. You can say, oh, hi, I'm mixed Korean and da-da-da. Okay, then you fit into this little category. In the US, it's a little bit different. It's been kind of weird. I just feel like there's so many things to say about that. And I actually wanted to write about it on the blog, but I keep pushing it off and off and off because it's been...
I can imagine there's so much to say. You can go in so many different directions.
Yeah.
But I guess to wrap up, because we get this question so often, and Emma and I really struggle with this because we're kind of just like, big question mark. And that is, where being the two podcasts and two forms of media that kind of take on a lot of conversation about being mixed, about race, about identity. Where would you like to see this conversation go, and what do you think the future holds?
Mm-hmm. I think we have all these conversations because it's not implicitly understood yet. These beliefs about mixed people or understanding where certain mixed people are from and just the thoughts that we're having, it's not implicitly understood on a wide scale. And so this is why we are having these very explicit, open, defined conversations. And we'll just keep talking about it until people eventually think, oh, that's just how it is. Oh, okay, move on, right? Like, there's nothing innately wrong with pointing out, oh, wow, you look like this and you look like that. Oh, your parentage must be this and that. There's nothing explicitly wrong with those conversations or questions. It's just the motivations behind it, the stereotypes and prejudices that exist behind those questions, because how you physically look cannot be changed and everyone can see that. So there should not be anything wrong with asking those questions. And I hope that we just can keep having these conversations and talking about it in a very graceful, educative, open manner, so that when we do in the future continue having those kind of questions, oh, where are your parents from? Where are you from? It doesn't come with a background of hurt, if that makes sense. It doesn't come with a feeling of guilt or how do I answer this?
Being othered, right.
It'll just be another question. That's kind of my hope. And I do think for Halfie Project, instead of us, quote unquote, pioneering anything, it'll just be archives. It will just be, oh, this is another story that we collected during this time of history and look how far we've come. And, I hope that by having these difficult conversations first, the next generations don't have to have them with that pain in mind. And it's so funny because this, especially when you're talking about culture and society and race and all of this, it can feel very vague. You're not actually grasping something.
It's like, what are you grasping? Yeah, completely. I feel the same. And like, because it's so emotional. And, like you were saying at the top of the hour, like, so much of this is anecdotal and it's so, again, feelings driven and which obviously allows us to relate to each other and empathize with one another, which is fantastic. But at the same time, it gets hard because it feels like sometimes you can't hold on to something very specific. But
yeah, I will give just one final thing to tie in with that. When I first began the Halfie Project, you had my mom and my dad, and they had very different perspectives on mixed Koreans and talking about these things. And I don't think either of them were in the wrong per se, but they definitely came from their perspectives and from their time. And I remember when I first mentioned, I'm going to do this, my mom's reaction was, nobody cares anymore about half Koreans, okay? Because she's Korean, and push it under the rug. Nobody cares about this stuff. You guys all were sent overseas, so it doesn't matter. Right?
We don't care anymore.
And then you have my dad's perspective, which was, oh, do you really want to bring this up? Because, it's been so long, and I think it's just going to be too painful to uncover old history that we've finally gotten over. So these are two different perceptions. And I remember when we released our first video, my mom was the one who said, oh, me too, I'm Halfie too. I also know what it feels like to be stuck between two countries. She said that to me, which was very enlightening. And then my dad also said, oh, you handled that with a lot more grace and less emotion than I expected this conversation to be. I think this could be a good thing. And so they've been kind of watching me from afar. And I think this is a good example of how minds can change through the work that we do without coming out and saying directly, you need to change your mind. That's never our purpose or point. And I think it will just happen naturally because people connect with stories and they get compassion, which gets understanding, which then leads naturally to change. And I think that's just what we're doing.
As always, thanks so much for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, as it really helps boost us in the charts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do share it with a friend or loved one or enemy. We're not picky. And if you haven't already ordered a copy of The Half of It, please order one now. It is the best way to support us as podcasters and authors. We couldn't do it without you.